Hi everyone, welcome back to Counseling and Virtual Care. In the last video we were looking at person-centered therapy. In this video we'll be looking at CBT. Now CBT is an interesting case because it's very widely used, but it's also historically brings two elements to it. One is the cognitive aspect and one is the behavioral aspect. And later down the track they amalgamated or they fused together to become what we know today as CBT. The problem with CBT is that there's a lot to talk about, and I wanted to keep it as condensed, as tight as possible in a quick short video, just to give you an overview. So after watching this video, you may have the sense that there are a lot of questions or things that you would like to explore, further explore, particularly in terms of how to apply these ideas, in terms of the techniques. I'm just going to mention the techniques. I'm not going to talk a lot about the techniques, so I'll leave that for you, either for your personal development. You can look at books, videos, and online resources in your own time, or here's my suggestion: do a further unit, do further formal development, specifically in this area of counseling, if this is something that you find useful and if you think that it's going to help you in your future work as counselors. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. So in this video, as I said before, we'll focus specifically on cognitive behavioral therapy. This is arguably one of the most used approaches in the US and in Australia, and this is because it tends to quickly identify the root of the problem and provide practical solutions to address them. Here's just a quick review of the different therapeutic approaches we will be looking at in this part of the unit, in this block of the unit. In the previous video, we talked about person-centered therapy. Now we're focusing on CBT. Now in this video, we'll talk about cognitive and behavioral approaches to counseling. And we are following the layout proposed by 𝓃𝒶𝑜'𝓈. We already used the book for PCT, person-centered therapy, but his book, or a link to his book, will be available on Canvas, so you can check out what I'm talking about. So again, 𝓃𝒶𝒂'𝓈 in his book proposed that cognitive and behavioral therapy are presented as different components, and we are specifically following this approach because the theoretical principles involving these two approaches were initially developed as different components. However, as these approaches started to become more popular and more used and share a certain degree, a certain theoretical commonality, these were merged into what we know today as CBT. Again, CBT, one whole thing. We like to follow 𝒂𝒂'𝓈's approach, identifying cognitive and behavioral. We should also mention that there are other iconic figures in both cognitive and behavioral branches of counseling worth mentioning, so beyond what we present here on the screen. For example, in the cognitive area, we can talk about Judith Beck, Donald Mickenbauch, or Albert Ellis. And in the behavioral area, we can mention people like John Brodus Watson, Joseph Wolpe, or Edward Thorndike. Cognitive behavioral therapies integrate both cognitive and behavioral principles and methods in a short-term approach. This is what we mentioned in the previous slide. CBT combines cognitive principles, or in other words, ways of thinking, with behavioral principles, or ways to act or behave. And it does so with the intention of quickly addressing the issue at hand and providing practical techniques to help clients overcome the issue. CBT is based on the premise that psychological distress is largely a function of disturbances in cognitive processes. Now, what does a disturbance in cognitive process mean? Well, the idea here is that our cognitions, or the way we think, has an effect on our emotions and behaviors, but also how we act can strongly affect our thought patterns and emotions. For example, if I think I am not worthy of love, then I'll probably be sad or depressed and wouldn't want to talk to other people. But it could also be that because I don't want to talk to people, I think that people don't like me and then I feel sad. In CBT, there is an emphasis on changing cognitions to produce desired changes in affect and behavior. And the keywords here are changing cognitions. So one of the main ideas of CBT is to help the client see the faults in the way of thinking to find a more logical or realistic way of assessing reality. For example, imagine you have a client who says, "Nobody likes me." We could help the client look for evidence supporting or dispelling this notion. It may very well be that some people don't like the client, and that's okay, that's normal. But surely some people will like the client. And hopefully helping this client see the faulty thinking will help him or them feel differently about the issue and behave in a more positive and productive way. CBT has generated more empirical research than any other psychotherapeutic model. And this is partly because, as we will see, CBT aims to quantify the severity of client symptoms, and if the intervention is effective, it is easy to identify the subjective improvement of using this therapeutic approach. CBT is based on a psychoeducational model. This is something I really like about CBT because it lends itself to helping clients through incorporating new information. Specifically, information about psychological processes and concepts. For example, if someone is experiencing anxiety, we can't assume that they know what anxiety is, and there may be an opportunity to explore what anxiety is together, client and counselor in sessions. There is an emphasis on discussing what is happening right here and right now and what can be done to address the problems we are facing in this moment, rather than an exploration of early childhood experiences and the root of the problem. Also, the client assumes an active role in the therapeutic process because the clients decide what they want to focus on, and they should be actively participating in the interventions proposed by the counselor. And that is why there is an emphasis on homework, because it is expected that the clients will be actively involved in the therapeutic process. And homework could involve something like asking someone to schedule their activity ahead of time in a journal to help them become more active and take accountability for the lack of action. Now here we have the principal components of CBT. Cognitive processing is given a central role in this model because humans give value and significance to the events in their lives and their environments, and cognitions are often associated with emotional reactions. Now let's use an example to understand this diagram a little bit better. Let's think about Charlie, a teenager suffering from social anxiety. He was preparing to attend a birthday party and had the following thoughts. I won't know what to say. Everyone will know I'm nervous. I look like a misfit. I'll want to leave right away. Now, the emotions and physiological responses that were stimulated by Charlie's maladaptive cognitions were predictable, and these were severe anxiety, sweating, physical tension, autonomic arousal, butterfly in the stomach, and Charlie had a dry mouth. His behavioral response was also problematic. Instead of facing the situation and trying to gain skills in uncomfortable social situations, he called his friend saying that he was sick and he couldn't go to the party. Now, because Charlie didn't go to the party, avoiding the event felt like a reward. And now he knows that when he gets nervous, he can simply leave and avoid the situation. And that is why avoidance became part of a negative cycle of thoughts, emotions, and behavior that deepened his problem with social anxiety. We can also think about how to disrupt this negative cycle of thoughts. Once more, by helping clients identify the unhelpful nature of certain thoughts and the effect this may have on our emotions and behavior, we can help them visualize this negative cycle diagram and motivate them to disrupt this process. There are many types of interventions we could use within the scope of CBT, and this will likely help our clients engage in different cognitive appraisal, resulting in a different effect and a new feeling. So, in a nutshell, CBT involves understanding ways of thinking. What are the sources of these ways of thinking? What is the content and what is the effect of thinking in this way? And once we identify those ways of thinking, the idea is to help clients change them using various means, leading to the client to change their self-concept, emotions, and behaviors. And these various means are directive, active, time-limited, focus on the present, problem-oriented, collaborative, structured, and empirical. Alright, and that's a little bit about CBT, how it works, and what it's all about. Let's now turn our attention to one of the origins of CBT, and that is Aaron Beck's cognitive therapy. Aaron Beck's cognitive therapy proposes that psychological problems derive from common processes such as faulty thinking, making incorrect inferences on the basis of inaccurate information, and failing to distinguish between fantasy and reality. The idea of faulty thinking is central to Beck's CT, and that means not being able to accurately assess a situation or a problem. Let's look at an example to illustrate this idea. We can think of a student who failed an assignment, and despite having a really good grade average and historically doing really well on previous assignments, failing this one leads the student to think that they will never be able to graduate. Of course, no one wants to fail an assignment, but we can see how the evidence doesn't support this thought process. That is why we talk about faulty thinking and making incorrect inferences. Now, CT is an insight-focused therapy with a strong psychoeducational component. Once more, the idea of insight comes from helping your clients understand the thought process and identify faults in their ways of thinking that may lead them to wrong assumptions and not being able to accurately assess reality. And the element of psychoeducation can help clients understand the effects of these unhelpful ways of thinking and disrupt the negative cycles. That is why we say CT emphasizes the recognition and change of negative or unhelpful thoughts and beliefs. Unlike the psychoanalytic perspective, CT assumes that people's internal communication is accessible to introspection, and that the client's beliefs have important meanings, and this can be discovered by the client rather than being interpreted by the therapist. In other words, by understanding what an unhelpful way of thinking is and what are the likely consequences of engaging in these ways of thinking, clients are able to identify the types of internal communication they have and disrupt these. So Aaron Beck identified 3 primary levels of cognitive processing, and these are consciousness, automatic thoughts, and schemas. The highest level of these is consciousness, and this is a state of awareness where decisions are made on a rational basis. This level of thinking allows us to interact with the environment, connect past memories with what is happening in the present moment, and it allows us to control our actions and plan what we should or could do based on the environmental demands. Beck and his colleagues believe that the therapist should encourage the development and application of conscious thought processes such as rational thinking and problem solving. The second level is called automatic thoughts, and these are cognitions that come rapidly to our minds when we are in the middle of a situation. Although we may subliminally know of the presence of these thoughts, we usually can't rationally analyze these automatic thoughts. These are often unspoken or private, but are fired rapidly as we evaluate the situations in which we're in. We can recognize our automatic thoughts if our attention is drawn to them, but these usually remain invisible to many people. And this can generate painful emotional reactions and dysfunctional behavior. Now let's see an example of what an automatic thought could look like. To do this, let's use the event thought emotion diagram we used a few slides back. Let's imagine we have a big assignment coming up shortly. That's our event. And our automatic thoughts are that we will never get it done on time, or that we don't have the skills to do a good job. And so we get really anxious as a result of these automatic thoughts arising in relation to this specific event. Now, the third and final level is called schemas. And these are basic templates or rules for information processing sitting at a deeper level of consciousness. And these represent individual beliefs about the self, others, and the world. And this is because people usually use filters and cognitive shortcuts to try and make sense of the world. There is so much information coming in that we usually try and find ways to organize it and categorize it. Schemas are seen to affect which aspects of a situation we attend to, and that usually informs how we see ourselves and others. If we have a negative self-view, we are likely to think about the world in a negative way and see others in a negative light. Now, schemas usually develop during the early childhood stages and are shaped throughout life. And these can be supportive or self-deprecating. A supportive schema is seen as an adaptive mechanism and can be quite useful. But in therapy, we usually focus on self-deprecating schemas such as "I'm unlovable" or "I'm a failure." And you can see the absolutist language used in these and how unlikely it is that these schemas are correct in every single situation. And that's why we try and help clients see through therapeutic interventions. Beck contended that people with emotional difficulties engage in logical errors that distort their objective reality. Again, jumping to wrong conclusions based on false premises such as "no one likes me" will naturally distort the reality and will lead to what Aaron Beck called cognitive distortions. And once more, the focus of therapy in this context is to help clients identify and challenge these cognitive distortions. Now let's look at a few examples of what we mean by Beck's cognitive distortions. So here we go. The first one is black and white thinking. This is when only two categories are used to assess events. For example, if someone says, "I am not perfect, I have failed." So you see how there's no middle ground. It's either "I'm the best" or "I'm the worst." Another example is overgeneralizing. This is when people see a wrong pattern using limited evidence or only one event as the basis for such conclusion. For example, someone saying "nothing good ever happens." So you can see how that's a little bit of a overstatement or overgeneralization. Arbitrary inferences. This is when clients reach a conclusion in the face of contradictory evidence. For example, someone afraid of flying says, "I know there are very little chances of having an accident, but I know my plane will crash." Once more, you can see how it's almost a mental filter, focusing only on what they want to focus on. Another example of cognitive distortions is overgeneralization. This is when a conclusion is made based on one isolated incident. For example, a really good student gets a bad grade and says, "I can't do anything right." Once more, we see how that, you could call it an error in logic. Another example of cognitive distortion is magnification and minimization. This is when clients exaggerate the significance of an event. For example, someone experiencing a panic attack may say, "If I faint, I will die." Once more, magnification. Finally, we've got personalization. This is when clients relate external events to themselves in the face of little or no evidence. For example, in the wake of an economic crisis, a manager may say, "It's my fault, I shouldn't have fired these people." So we can imagine how it's very unlikely that firing a few employees will have a macroeconomic impact on a global crisis. All right, If you remember, we mentioned that cognitive therapy is an amalgamation between cognitive and behavioral principles. So far, we've been focusing on cognitive principles. So let's now look at the behavioral principles. We previously mentioned that there are many iconic figures within the behavioral space. However, scholars argue that Burroughs Frederick Skinner was the father of behaviorism. Skinner proposed that individuals don't have freedom of choice because they are conditioned by their interaction with their environment. He emphasized that cause and effect arising from everyday experiences shape and conditions our behavior. For example, according to Skinner, one may not necessarily be genetically conditioned to experience phobias, but if a dog chases you down the street and bites you, it is likely that you'll develop a fear of dogs. He acknowledged that thoughts and feelings exist, but argued that these do not cause our actions and are a mere consequence of our interaction with the environment. Now, moving past Skinner, we can talk about 4 areas of behavioral therapy. And these are classical conditioning, operant conditioning, social learning theory, and cognitive behavioral therapy. Let's look at classical conditioning. Pavlov illustrated classical conditioning through his experiments with dogs. He proposed that he could create a conditioned response based on pairing an unconditioned stimulus and a neutral stimulus. As we see in this picture, Pavlov knew that when dogs are presented with food, they tend to salivate in anticipation of eating the food. He also knew that a neutral stimulus such as ringing a bell would produce no response in the dogs. So once more, this picture, the top left, dogs are presented with food, they salivate. Top right, dog is presented with a ringing bell, there's no response. But Pavlov hypothesized that if he paired the neutral stimulus, in this case the sound of the bell, with the food, he would get a conditioned response without the unconditioned stimulus after a number of repetitions. So, bottom part of the picture, on the left we see Pavlov is pairing the ringing of the bell with presenting the food, doing that multiple times. Bottom right we see the dog salivates as soon as he hears the bells because he thinks, or it thinks, that the food is going to come shortly after. And this happens without the subject, in this case the dogs, having awareness. And that is why this is called classical conditioning. The idea is that classical conditioning is a conditioned response to a stimulus, and events occurring closely together in time are often stored in the brain as a mental association. And Pavlov was looking to elicit a conditioned response or an automatic response that occurs as a result of previous experience, again involving little awareness by the learner. And here we have another short clip extracted from The Office, one of my favorite TV shows, where they demonstrate this idea of classical conditioning. We've got Jim Halpert and Dwight Schrute. It's just 1 or 2 minutes. I thought it was a fun idea to illustrate this classical conditioning concept. I hope you enjoy it.
Oh, damn, lost another file. Gonna have to reboot again. Hey Dwight, do you want an Altoid?
What do you think?
In school, we learned about this scientist who trained dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell by feeding them whenever a bell rang. So for the past couple weeks, I've been conducting a similar experiment. Dwight, want an Altoid?
Okay.
Altoid?
Sure.
And Dwight?
Vinput? Yes.
What are you doing? What?
I don't know. Well, my mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden. 𝓃𝒶𝑜𝓈.
And there you have it, that's The Office for you. It's a fantastic show, and in this case they're showing in a couple of minutes what classical conditioning can look like. Alright, let's look at a second area of behavioral therapy, and this is operant conditioning. Operant conditioning involves learning where behaviors are influenced mainly by the consequences that follow them. It also involves the ABC model with an antecedent or an event preceding the learning process, the behavior that is intended to be modified, and the consequences of the learning process, hence ABC. And this ideally will result in changed behavior. The key principles include positive and negative reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. If the environmental changes brought about by the behavior provide a reward or help us avoid unwanted consequences, it is likely that the behavior will occur again. If the environmental changes provide no reward or produce aversive stimuli, the behavior is not enforced and it's likely that it will not happen again. Okay, here we have a nice table explaining the operant conditioning a little bit better. As you see at the top of the table, we can introduce a stimuli, and this is called positive because we are adding something. Or remove a stimulus, and this is called negative because we're, again, removing something. We can also think about whether stimulus increases or decreases the behavior. Now, positive reinforcement is when there is an addition of a valued or pleasant consequence after the behavior. For example, if a student does well, she gets praise and a good grade, and this is likely will have a positive impact on her studying hard to get that reward again in the future. Negative reinforcement is when there is an escape, avoidance or removal of an aversive or unpleasant stimuli. For example, we will likely wake up before the alarm clock goes off if the sound of the clock alarm is horrible. And we wake up before the alarm to avoid listening to that sound, so that stimulus is taken away. Negative reinforcement. Now, punishment is when there is an addition of an aversive consequence after the behavior. For example, if we get in trouble at school, then there is the introduction of a negative consequence, which could be spending time in detention. Finally, extinction involves withholding a previously reinforced response. For example, a baby crying and getting attention would be a positive reinforcement. But if the wanted consequence, in this case is getting attention, is removed, then the behavior is not rewarded anymore and the baby will likely stop making a tantrum because they're not getting the desired response, they're not getting what they want. Again, the behavior will hopefully be extinct. Let's now move to social learning theory. Social learning theory was developed by Albert Bandura and Richard Walters in the 1960s. It is an interactional, interdisciplinary and multimodal aspect of CBT. It involves a reciprocal interaction between the environment, personal factors and individual behavior. And this means that, once more, the environment or the things that happen to us will influence how we interpret things, our beliefs and preferences, which will ultimately influence our behavior. A basic assumption is that people are capable of self-directed behavior change and the person is the agent of change. And this is predominantly done through observational learning or modeling. The idea here is that watching someone else do something gives new information. For example, one of my clients will usually try to win at any cost while playing board games, even if that involved cheating. He would deliberately try to cheat and not take responsibility for his cheating when I caught him red-handed doing the cheating. However, I was happy to lose a game and acknowledge that I was beaten by a better player. And this eventually led my client to believe that it was okay to lose, and maybe the fun was about playing and sharing time rather than winning. So because I wasn't cheating and I was happy to lose and I was comfortable with that, I was in a way modeling that it's okay to lose. This translated later down the path into the schoolyard, and this client stopped getting into physical altercations while playing sports because in a way he understood that it was kind of okay to lose and the fun was not about winning, it's about something else. Now the fourth and final area of behavioral therapy, we can talk about cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is because as research expanded during the 1970s, scholars started to incorporate cognitive theories and strategies into their behavioral treatment programs. They noted that the cognitive perspective added context, depth, and understanding to behavioral interventions. For example, depressed clients will often not have enough positive reinforcement from their environment to maintain adaptive behavior. Similarly, Beck always advocated for the inclusion of behavioral components to his treatments because he recognized the effectiveness of these strategies in reducing symptoms and because he saw a strong relationship between cognitions and behaviors. I also wanted to quickly mention a few techniques used in CBT. While developing each of these will probably require a whole unit, let's quickly mention some of these. Also keep in mind that we included relevant resources in the tutorial section on Canvas if you want to learn more about these CBT techniques that I'll just briefly mention now. Now, some techniques used in CBT include, but are not limited to, cognitive restructuring. And we mentioned that cognitive restructuring is all about identifying what we call logical errors or faulty ways of thinking, and the idea is to help clients identify these errors in logic and together collaboratively try to identify ways to change the way they think and talk about these kind of things. Now, bibliotherapy and psychoeducation both involve this idea of, an educational component within these approaches. And the idea is to provide as much education as possible to the client because then they will be able to take that with them beyond sessions and hopefully apply their learnings and insights into new and unexpected experiences and life events. If they get the insight through educational components, then hopefully they can apply that through a range of life situations. So bibliotherapy specifically talks about providing written resources. Nowadays there's a lot of online resources for the client to be able to again learn certain presentation symptoms. This idea what we're talking about before, the conceptual diagram in terms of the antecedent, the behavior, the consequence, the cognitive appraisal, and how all of this is connected. So all these things will help clients hopefully once more develop insight and apply those learnings throughout or in the future in different life events and situations. Behavioral activation. Behavioral activation is something that is usually done when there's, for example, difficulties in doing something, difficulties becoming motivated to take a specific activity or follow a schedule. This is usually identifying relation to impaired functioning. It could be due to, for example, depression. If someone is feeling a little bit depressed or with flat mood, they lack the motivation to engage in certain activities. Again, behavioral activation will help with that. And basically what it does is it will break down certain activities to try and motivate the client to engage them. Hopefully we'll have enough time during the tutorials to do a little bit of behavioral activations and a few other examples. So if this explanation is not super clear at this stage, don't worry, you'll have plenty of time during the tutorials to expand on this and maybe put a little bit of this into practice. We can also think about homework. Again, the idea of homework is based on the collaborative nature of CBT. If we give clients homework, they can start looking at developing these insights and move past beyond the counseling context. It also gains a lot of time because otherwise everything will happen in sessions and the therapeutic process will be longer. And remember that CBT is all around identifying the issue quickly and try to provide strategies quickly, so short term. In terms of social insertion skills, that sometimes is something that I do with young clients, and particularly around certain difficulties. For example, if someone is presenting certain difficulties in terms of the social domain and being unable to develop relationship effectively or maintain relationships effectively, that sometimes, those few learning components in terms of social skills is what the sessions are all about. So for example, little things like what is a friend? What is the concept of a friend? If there's issues of bullying, do I want to be bullied? Do I enjoy being bullied? What is a bully? What does a bully look like? Is a bully my friend? So again, helping clients understand the logical ways of thinking to identify, okay, maybe it's better if I stay away from the bullies, and what are the things I can say to a bully? What does a friend look like? So then certain characteristics I will be seeking in certain people to be friends with them. So again, learning. For example, there's another client where we are focusing a little bit of the rules of conversation, taking turns. Should I interrupt other people? Should I talk incessantly? What happens to other people when I talk too much about myself and I don't pay attention to them and what it's interesting for them? So again, you see social skills. In terms of assertion skills, some of the things that I've been exploring with my clients is in terms of being able to hold your ground and say what you want to say in a nice way. I usually use 3 ways of talking: the aggressive, assertive, or weak, and help clients identify what is an aggressive way of communicating, what is a weak way of communicating, and what is an assertive way of communicating. Again, hopefully we can do a little bit of exercises during the tutorials. This is fun, and hopefully you can apply that with your future clients. In terms of applied behavioral analysis, this is a functional way or a way to do what is functioning, what is not functioning, and what are the things specifically that we need to improve in order to help our client get to a better place. And again, develop insight into what is happening for them and what is needed for them in order to get to a better place. Progressive muscle relaxation is all around, just like the name says, it's all around teaching the clients relaxing their muscles. There are plenty of tutorials out there where they will take you, for example, through a script, recorded script for a couple of minutes. I tend to use this with my young clients because it helps them identify the tension in their body, identifying that perhaps they are a little bit stressed or anxious, and think about what they can do to learn how to relax. Systematic desensitization, again, hopefully that's something that we've got enough time in the tutorials to do. The idea here is to progressively desensitize someone in relation to for example, a phobia or a stimulus that the client finds difficult to control. It's usually applied in phobias. For example, imagine someone is really afraid of cockroaches. So the idea is you'll start talking about cockroaches with the client, so they will slowly become used to the idea of cockroaches. Then perhaps you can present them with a picture or a drawing of a cockroach, then a picture, and then finally some clients will choose to actually interact with a cockroach to slowly and progressively become desensitized to that specific stimulus. In vivo exposure or flooding, these are both very similar to variations, and the idea is that clients here will be exposed to directly to a specific stimulus that they find confronting. For example, imagine someone is a little bit of germophobic, so perhaps you could deliberately try and ask your client to drop something on the floor, pick it up, and, for example, say a piece of clothing, a piece of garment, the jumper. Drop it on the floor, make sure that the floor is dirty, pick it up and wear it without cleaning that. So it can be quite uncomfortable for some clients, but they are in a way exposed in vivo to their uncomfortable feelings, and being able to identify the feelings, identify where in the body they are feeling, those unwanted feelings, and what they can do to try and overcome that initial reaction of, oh no, I don't want to be here. And flooding can be a little bit more extreme. For example, if someone is afraid of elevators, put them in an elevator. If someone is afraid of heights, take them to a rooftop. However, I would not, and let me repeat, I would not advise any of you guys, any of learning or beginner counselors, to try flooding techniques with clients. It takes a lot of training, so be careful about that. And EMDR, it's all about helping clients create new neuronal connections when they are telling a story or talking about a story. It's usually applied in PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. So the idea is that, for example, if there's with PTSD, there's a lot of triggers. Imagine someone is being the subject of domestic violence. So someone is verbally abusing or physically abusing your client, and that happened in a room with a couch, and then perhaps the couch is a trigger for that client. Every time they see a similar couch, they automatically go to that time of their lives when they were either physically or verbally abused by the perpetrator. So the idea is to disrupt those connections with new connections, and that could be done through the movement of the eyes while reliving the story or the traumatic events. Once more, this is a highly trained technique. This is not something that we will try in the tutorials. And I will advise you not to try these as a beginner counselor, once more, because you can worsen someone's experience and maybe levels of anxiety by not knowing exactly how to handle these complex technique. Now, finally, let's look at some strengths and weaknesses of CBT. CBT has been applied to a wide range of psychological disorders, issues, and population settings. For example, it can be used to deal with phobias, panic attacks, depression, PTSD, and a variety of presentations. It also encourages self-help, provides continuous feedback, structure, and direction to enable evaluation. This is really good because it provides the client with the necessary tools to apply what they've been learning, and hopefully they can use it in future and diverse situations to minimize relapse. It's also short-term and direct. This can be good because it minimizes resource allocation, for example, time and money, and it quickly identifies the issue to be addressed and provides techniques to improve the symptoms. However, we can also talk about some of the weaknesses or limitations of CBT. CBT has been criticized because it can limit the exploration of past experiences and roots of the problem. And this is because it focuses too much on the here and now without making emphasis on early childhood experiences and understanding certain elements that may have caused the symptoms. CBT can also be too mechanistic or prescriptive. While there are many techniques to be used, counselors may readily try to use them without necessarily paying attention to adjusting the techniques and interventions to accommodate each client's needs. And finally, it can focus too much on positive thinking and being too simplistic. Once more, because it is short-term and directive, it may not propose to fully explore clients' negative experiences and dwells on learning how to adjust our self-talk from a positive perspective. So once more, this is a condensed version in half an hour or so of what CBT looks like. You can see that there's a lot of content that is very condensed here, and you probably want to expand on these either in future units or in your own time. I hope you enjoy this video. I hope you take some positives out of this, and hopefully this is giving you a spark to start thinking about what CBT could look like and how I could apply these in my own practice. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you in the next video.